Well, thanks for sticking around to the very end. Hopefully we can make this worth your while. And my talk is really going to continue on with what you just heard about from David and Margaret about the change that we're seeing in our world and our legal system. And so Chief Justice Roberts, when he was being confirmed for the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, made the statement that politicians and judges, for that matter, should be wary of the assumption that the future will be little more than an extension of things as they are. And what he's basically saying is that we're in this period of just unprecedented change, more than any other people have ever experienced in human history. We have social change, we have economic change, we have political change, but what I'm going to focus on is technology change, which is driving a lot of these other changes. And it's really profound how much it's changing the world. When we wake up every morning, it's just sort of human nature to think today is the same as it was yesterday and the same as it will be tomorrow. But what that's masking is that we are in this period of just enormous technological change. And so the organizers of this conference thought it'd be good to end by sort of looking forward. What can we expect coming up that will affect our lives, but also more importantly, our court systems and the delivery of legal services? It's really hard to predict the future, and I'm not going to actually do that because Bill Gates said anyone who tries to tell you what technology is going to be like more than 5 years into the future is full of it. There's just no way to guess that. There's all kinds of weird stuff out there in our future. Ray Kurzweil, who is the chief of engineering at Google, has made all kinds of technology predictions, and he's usually been correct. He predicts by 2040 we will integrate with machines, and humans as we know it will no longer exist. He's taking several hundred pills a day to last that long. A lot of people don't want to get to that point where they become part of a machine, but that's 20-something years away. That's a plausible scenario. Who knows if that's going to come true or not? So I don't want to go there. There's a lot of science fiction writers who have now quit writing science fiction because anything they think of, people are actually doing now. So what I want to focus on is the technologies that are here today that have arrived and are just beginning to interface with our legal systems. And so we're just seeing the early signs of these technologies. So it's not science fiction, it's real technologies, real science that are here now, and that I think will have just an enormous impact over the next 5 years or so in how we, the types of cases we deal with, but also how we deliver legal services. And so it's a shorter time span, the next 5 years, but as you, I hope, will see, that's going to be a dramatic 5 years or so. So if you look at the last century, the 20th century, I count sort of 4 transformative technologies. We had the car, the television, the computer, and the airplane. And these 4 inventions were spread out over 100 years, but they had all kinds of implications, first and second and third order effects that we never would have anticipated before that technology came along, in terms of how we live our lives, how we interact with each other, how business is conducted, and even how the law is conducted. And all these 4 technologies, we had a lot of time to adapt to them, but were profoundly revolutionary or disruptive, as we just heard about that term. If you look today, there's a whole bunch of these technologies all coming out of the laboratory at the same time, dozens of them. And here's just some of them. They're probably too small for you to read, but each of these technologies is profound in its own way. And when we look back 10 years from now, we're going to see every single one of these technologies is going to have enormous implications for our own lives. And it's already starting to happen now, but certainly will also affect the practice and the substance of law. And so that's what I want to focus on, is how are all these new technologies, all that sort of are coming out of the lab at the same time. When I was a grad student in genetics a few decades ago, all this stuff was science fiction. People were talking about these type of things, but it didn't exist. Today, they all exist. Every one of these technologies now, there's actual companies, there's actual products, and there's actual court cases involving every one of the technologies on this list. And our legal system's really at the front line because every one of these technologies also doesn't have any regulation or any sufficient regulation because they've come so quickly that our other governance bodies, our legislators and our regulators have not responded to these technologies. And so the courts are sort of sitting there as our only body, are in the front line to deal with all these technologies. And so our legal systems, our court systems are going to be dealing with every one of these technologies, and already are starting now, and they're going to have profound implications, again, for the substance, but also the practice of law. Not only do we have so many technologies coming at the same time, the pace at which they're coming is greatly accelerated. And this is a hard graph to see from far away, but 100 years ago when you had new technologies like the car or electricity or indoor plumbing, it took about 50 or 60 years from the time the first people got it to half the population got it. So there's this gradual incorporation of technologies 100 years ago. Today, it's shrunk down to like a couple years when you get a new smartphone or a tablet or some new technology. From when the first people get it to when half or 100% of the people have it, it's just a matter of a couple years. So again, we have way more technologies than we've ever had in the history of humankind coming forward, and they're coming at a much faster pace. And that's why our legislators and our regulators just can't keep up. Courts don't have any choice. When people come to you with a dispute about some new technology or want to use the technology in the dispute resolution, you can't say, no, we're not ready for it. You have to deal with it, unlike our legislators and regulators. So that's why the court system is going to be on the front lines in all these technologies. I love this graphic. It's sort of, if you look at the history of where we've been on technology, you can see we're on this sort of sharp uptick a little bit in terms of how technology is changing our world. But in reality, if you sort of look a little bit forward, we're really more like this. We're right at the edge now of this. All these technologies are exponentially starting to increase, and we're on the elbow of that exponential increase. And so again, Ray Kurzweil has talked about we had as much technology change in the first 14 years of this century as we had in the entire last century. And he predicts we'll have that again in the next 7 years and then 3.5 years, because we're on an exponential, not a linear curve. And so if that's true or anywhere near true, we're more like facing this kind of scenario than sort of this gradual change. So we need to be ready for the type of disruptive innovation we just heard about, because this will be very disruptive. So what I want to do is look at how these technologies affect the court systems in sort of 4 ways. Of the types of cases we're going to see, the types of evidence people are going to bring into the courtroom, how this will affect access to justice, and then how it will affect courts as an institution. I'm mostly going to focus on U.S. cases because I'm a U.S. law professor, former lawyer. But the interesting thing about technology, unlike law or courts, is technology is universal. It is global. It is international. And so the exact same technologies are now coming forward in every country around the world. And every legal system and every court system is going to have to deal with these technologies at the same time. And so I will use some American examples to show the first examples of some of these, but they're also happening in other countries, I'm sure, and will be happening just like they are here in the United States. So first, let's talk with the types of cases we're going to see. So my favorite issue is genetics. I have a PhD in genetics. I was trained as a geneticist before I went into law. And there's no question genetics is going to have all kinds of profound implications. I teach a course on genetics in the law, and when I started teaching it 20 years ago, I was sort of what could happen in the future. Now we can't possibly cover everything that is actually happening. There's so many ways genetics is now coming into our legal system. It's coming into our lives too. If you have cancer or know someone who has cancer, if they're not having their tumor genotype, they're not getting state of care medical services. The genetics is profoundly changing both the prognosis and treatment of cancer. You can get genetically tested now to find out all kinds of susceptibilities you might have. I've been whole genome sequenced to find all these different genes. We all have hundreds of them, every single one of us, that affects our predispositions to all kinds of things like Alzheimer's or different types of cancers or obesity, all these different factors. We can find that out if we want now. Do we want other people to find out? So we have all these information now about our medicine, our medical history, and our health that are available, but we're also starting to find all kinds of other genes that affect other things, like your musical abilities, your intelligence, your height, your athletic abilities. None of these are deterministic, but they affect this. They predispose us. And one of these areas is in violence and aggression. And so there's a gene called the MAOA gene, that if you have, so this is on the X chromosome, so it's particularly, men are vulnerable because you only have one copy. So if you have a mutated version, that's the only one you have, you're affected by it. And if you have the low expression version of that, and you have a normal upbringing, it has no effect on your violence or criminality. But if you're in a really bad upbringing, your first couple years of life, if you have the normal copy of the gene, you have about 11% chance of being a criminal or violent person. If you have the mutated form, you're up to about 80%. So we now know in our communities that these poor little kids, 1/3 of boys have this mutation, by the way, that these little boys who are in these communities who are abused or otherwise brought up very terribly in the first 2 years of life, at age 2, when they're just this cute little guy, they're at an 80% chance of being a violent criminal when they grow up. What should we do with that information? We don't know what to do with it. We haven't responded to this, but we've known this now for a few years. These studies have been repeated like dozens of times now. It's a fact. It's a well-proven fact. How do we deal with this information? Well, one thing it is being done with it is looking after the fact. After the terrible crimes have been committed, now we have lawyers who are introducing this evidence to argue for mitigation of the sentencing of someone who has this gene and this bad upbringing. And we've had a number of cases here in the United States. We've had ones in other countries like Britain and Italy I know of, and I'm sure other places as well, that have tried to grapple with this. And it raises this profound issue. If someone is predisposed to being violent, should that somehow excuse their activity when they commit a horrendous crime? Not everybody who has that bad upbringing and their predisposition does commit crime. So it's not inevitable, but it's a much higher risk than it's someone else. So how do we actually deal with that? It's a profound issue. And we had a case, for example, in Tennessee, where this man murdered his estranged wife's friend and tried to kill his wife as well in a multi-hour horrible thing with an axe and a knife and a gun right in front of their children and so on. It was just this horrible crime. And the state brought a capital murder case against him. And he introduced evidence to show that he not only had a terrible upbringing, but he has this gene. And the jury came back and not only didn't give them capital murder, didn't give him murder at all, gave him manslaughter with a maximum sentence of 7 years. And so in 7 years, which is about to run out this year actually, he will be back on the street presumably because he had that gene and he can't control himself. So, on one hand you say, yes, he was maybe less responsible, but on the other hand, he's back on the street. Do we really want someone who can't control himself back on the street? So it's again this profound dilemma that all of a sudden our courts are having to decide. We have dozens of these cases now going through our court systems where judges and juries are having to make this decision based on this new information we never had before. We have drones, a fascinating technology, have all kinds of profound implications. I was just reading a story in the New York Times this morning about how they're showing in Mosul there's still fighting going on because these drones are flying over and seeing innocent people being shot by ISIS who are still there and so on. We're getting so much more information and accidents and tragedies and fires and all kinds of things from drones, but it's creating all kinds of new legal issues for courts. We have people bringing claims that they shouldn't have been spied on, that the police used a drone to spy on them, that people are tracking their companies are tracking their employees with drones. Is that an unfair, does it somehow violate some kind of law? We've had a couple cases in the United States where someone shot down a drone over their backyard. And the question is that a crime to shoot down someone else's drone that's spying on your daughter in her bathing suit? Which is what this guy did, and he got off. Said he had a right to do that. So again, we get this really interesting, fascinating new technology with all kinds of benefits, but all these new legal issues are percolating up already as we try to figure out, what should be the rules of this technology. There's no rules out there. It's just brand new, and so the courts are having to sort of figure this out on a case-by-case basis. You've probably heard a lot about driverless cars. Where I'm from in Phoenix, we have, I think, 4 companies testing driverless cars, and you're constantly seeing them on the road. They have this little rotating thing, this LiDAR thing on the roof. That's how you can tell it's a autonomous car. And they're testing them in several cities across the United States, around the world. The expectation is that these will reduce accidents dramatically by 80, 90% maybe. But on other times, they're going to mess up, and they're going to cause accidents. And the question is, when should they be liable? How should they be liable? But more importantly, how should they make decisions when they encounter a situation? So right now, we as drivers are going to encounter, each of us, a few bizarre situations in our life where we're going to have to make an immediate decision. And so we don't have to sort of pre-think through the millions of possible scenarios because we're going to trust human judgment in that moment to make, hopefully, a good decision, sometimes not. But these cars have to be pre-programmed ahead of time to make all those decisions. So they have to make decisions about whether they should kill the occupant of the car or kill the 2 people walking on the sidewalk, because it might be one or the other. And it all has to be pre-decided and then second-guessed later in a court. And so it's going to be just incredibly interesting to see as these cars get deployed, and they're coming very quickly. I think most of the manufacturers are going to have these on the road within 2019 to 2022. and they do get in these accidents, how do we judge the type of decisions, the engineering decisions that go into them of how to make these ethical trade-offs? Will people be given the choice of what kind of car to buy in terms of how selfish it is? So when you ask people, how do you want these cars to be decided, they sort of have a utilitarian thing. Save the most lives, be the most, ethical in that way. But when you ask them what kind of car do they want to buy, they would much rather kill the pedestrian than their kid in the back seat. And so will we be starting to sell cars that have a selfish algorithm as opposed to the equal algorithm? And then who's responsible if you buy the selfish algorithm car? So again, these profound issues suddenly before us. We have GPS. It's being used for hundreds of cases right now. In fact, the Supreme Court's going to decide a case this next year in the United States about whether you need a search warrant to track someone's location with the GPS in their cell phone. Over 1 million times a year, the police in the United States access phone records to find locations of either suspects or known criminals or whatever, often without any kind of judicial process. Sometimes they have, sometimes they don't. The state laws are all over the place on this. Internationally, they're all over the place. So the U.S. Supreme Court is going to decide this year sort of what the rules are. But there's all kinds of other applications of people you can buy these little devices to stick in your spouse's car. Is that a privacy violation? You can track your kid. You can buy a program that tells you where your kid is and how fast they're moving and giving you a real-time text if they're moving outside of the lines you draw or they're moving faster than lines you draw. I have a teenage daughter who just got her driver's license. We're really interested in thinking about doing that because it'd be nice to know that. She already got one speeding ticket. So maybe we need to keep a track of her. I don't know. But this is a case in California, and there's been a number of these cases where, in this case, a teenager was charged with speeding, and his father went to court with him and introduced comprehensive records showing exactly how fast he was moving and where using GPS records. And the funny thing about the case is the newspaper report said the teenager sat in the courtroom with his mouth agape as his father's showing the court he has complete records of where his son has been and how fast he's been moving. He never told his son he was keeping track of this. In this case, the judge said, we're going to go with the police rather than the GPS, but in other cases, the GPS has trumped the police radar about how fast the person was actually moving. So again, we have this new technology that's giving us all kinds of information. I recently lost my cell phone, and I called my wife and I said, I've lost my cell phone. And she said, well, go to this website. And my vendor or cell phone provider is T-Mobile. I go to T-Mobile, and you can see everywhere I've been for the last year within a few feet. I had no idea that's on the website, and my wife can see it. I'm starting to think, what have I done in this last year? I mean, it's very sort of revealing all of a sudden. But I could see that my cell phone has been laying on a street for about half an hour where I dropped it, that someone had picked it up and walked into a particular parking lot. It was now moving west on I-10 in Phoenix. I called the police, and they said, we get this all the time. See if you can track where it ends up. And whoever had it went into a residential area and then turned off the phone, and I never found the exact house they went to. But this happens all the time. So you're getting these records where all of you are with your cell phone on right now. There's a record now being kept of where you are. Who gets access to that? Divorce lawyers are now asking for that. Police are asking for that. Who gets access? It's a question we're just having to grapple with. We're getting this whole movement of artificial intelligence. I'm teaching my first course on artificial intelligence in the fall. It's a fascinating area. And so the thing about artificial intelligence, what's really changed is this thing called machine learning, where these machines will no longer be programmed what to do. They'll figure out what to do on their own. They'll self-learn. And so they'll go far beyond what the engineer programmed them to do. They'll make their own decisions and learn from that. And that's going to be incredibly valuable in all kinds of ways. But it also creates sort of this black box problem, as we don't know why it did what it did. And so now we're creating these machines that go out there and do their own thing. And people are worried about, 30 years from now that these things will decide humans are in their way and destroy us all. And so there's this concern about the long-term impact of this super intelligent. There's some great books, and Elon Musk and other people have been talking about this. But right now we have these things, and the question is their accountability. And so this group in the Netherlands created a bot, which is an online program, and told it to go out, gave it a bunch of bitcoins and go out and do interesting things. And it went out and it purchased a stolen passport, and it purchased some ecstasy, and the police actually tried to arrest the bot because no one told it to do those things. It made those decisions on itself. We have a criminal bot. So how do you decide who's responsible when the machine is now making the decisions to do bad things? Is it whoever set it loose in the world, even though you had no intention it's going to do something bad? So it's creating this, again, this profound type of issue. Virtual reality is another, our virtual world. So Second Life, I don't know if any of you have been on that. It's now being replaced by an upgraded version that's going to be virtual reality version of this. But you had all kinds of people getting married in Second Life. You had these people who have their alternate identities. They're different people, and they actually are conducting businesses and having relationships with a different entity that's them controlling it, but it's that avatar. And some people have several avatars, and they're completely different people. I did my first Second Life as actually a conference in Second Life on the law and Second Life. And you basically create an avatar, and one of my students created this for me. It looks sort of like me. And so I came in the morning for the conference, and they helped me get into the room. And I go to sit down, and I sit down, and it's this incredibly buxom, scantily dressed woman. And so I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I hope this isn't being videotaped. My wife will see this. Well, the woman got up to ask a question, and I realized it's a male PhD student who I'm supervising, who has a complete different sex, different looking avatar. There's no reality who they are whatsoever. So at that point, my student had to leave, and so I go up to the podium and I talk, and I couldn't figure out how to leave the podium. And you can go to that conference website on Second Life today, and I'm still standing up at the podium, my avatar. And every other speaker had to come up and stand next to me and talk, and they couldn't get me out of the way. But so it's an awkward world, but it's getting more and more sophisticated and easier to use. This is a case from a guy in Phoenix, where I live, where he wasn't doing so well. He's an engineer. He'd been laid off, so he's now working in a call service center. He's got diabetes. He's not very healthy. And he comes home every night and spends 8 hours in Second Life and all weekend in Second Life. And he started a bunch of businesses in Second Life. He's actually making more money in Second Life because they have a currency called the Linden dollar that's worth real money. You can convert it to US dollars by just clicking a switch. And so he's making more money in his online businesses than he is in his real world job, and thinking about quitting his real world job. But he's also gotten married in Second Life to another woman, even though he's married in the real world to another woman. And his wife, in this article in the Wall Street Journal, wants to bring a legal lawsuit saying he's committing bigamy or adultery by engaging in a virtual marriage. And you can go to Google and do Second Life weddings. You'll see hundreds and hundreds of people have gotten married in Second Life. So should we recognize those kind of marriages? What if he dies? He's not very healthy. Who gets his estate? He co-owns these businesses with his virtual world wife who lives in Alberta, Canada, who he's never met. Does his real world wife get half the money, or does his second world wife get it? So again, these profound new issues are suddenly before us in the courts that we never had to deal with before. And then this is another sort of inappropriate conduct pattern case, but it always raises interesting issues. This is a case in Tampa Bay, where the Tampa Bay City Council passed a very sensible ordinance that said there's no adult entertainment allowed in residential areas in Tampa Bay. Very simple. These people bought a house in a residential area in Tampa Bay and put a bunch of scantily clad young women in there running around, and then sold a service that they put video cameras all throughout the house, and you can buy into this, called Voyeur Dorm or something, and you can buy that service and pay money to watch these young women cavorting around. Kind of weird, I know, but apparently they got customers, and so they were running this business, and the city of Tampa Bay goes, you're violating our ordinance. You're not allowed to have adult entertainment, which this clearly is, in a residential area of Tampa Bay, which this clearly is. And the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals says, no, you have no jurisdiction. Because the adult entertainment is not occurring in Tampa Bay, it's occurring in the cyber world. And you don't have jurisdiction over the cyber world. And so that's a profound decision, because we're now having all these activities go digital online that aren't located in a geographical location as we've always had before. And the question is, how does jurisdiction affect that? And we've had all kinds of cases coming out of sites like Second Life of, someone does something in Germany that the police in Netherlands or US try to enforce against. We just had a case in Canada last week. The Supreme Court of Canada held that that Google's violation of Canadian law means they have to take down that site all over the world. So you have one country's law now dictating what can happen in every other country in the world. If we continue that we'll just have a complete mess. But on the other hand, these activities cross national boundaries. So again, we have this profound new dilemma created by technology that our courts are having to try to resolve. And then just sort of a humorous one, we have a lot of Pokemon Go lawsuits. This is something my son does all the time. And there's now been a whole bunch of lawsuits of people trespassing or suing Pokemon when they walk across the street and get hit by a car because they're looking for a Pokemon. So we have a lot of new types of cases coming up. But we also have a lot of new types of evidence coming into the courtroom, which is another area these technologies are affecting. So we have, just all these different technologies I've already sort of been talking about, and they raise a lot of issues for the courts. There's going to be the traditional admissibility, whether it's reliable and valid and so on. But there's a lot of new types of issues these technologies are going to raise about privacy and fairness and deception and Fourth and Fifth Amendment in the United States, juror understanding, presentations, even how we're going to logistically present this in a courtroom. So let me give you a few examples of this. So again, one is GPS evidence. So we're now getting GPS evidence in more and more types of cases of all kinds of police, of divorce cases, monitoring of employees, of sex offenders, and so on. And again, there's questions of, how do you introduce GPS evidence? Do you have to have an expert? And the courts are split in the United States on this. Some say you have to have expert evidence. Other ones say it can be judicially noticeable. So again, police are just routinely using this, and now all of a sudden courts are saying, wait a minute, how do we know this is really reliable enough to actually use without having some kind of a process to check that? We have brain scanning being used for all kinds of implications now. We've had a few cases where people have tried to use this as a lie detection. Most jurisdictions don't allow you to use a polygraph in a court case. These neural lie detections are better than a polygraph. Everybody agrees with that, but they're not 100% proven, and they certainly need a lot more study. But basically, it's what Mark Twain says. It's much easier to tell the truth than tell a lie. When you tell a lie, you have to be much more strategic and think, now, what did I tell them before? How will this play out? And so they can look at your brain activity, and they see much more parts of your brain working when you're telling a lie than when you're telling a truth. And at least in laboratory studies, which may not be representative of the real world, they're about 90% accurate, not 100%. And so we've already had people try to introduce this in a court case. So far without success. The courts have said it's not ready for prime time yet, but it's probably just a matter of time it is. And so what would that mean for our judicial system? We start doing lie detection of not only witnesses and defendants, but maybe also jurors and judges. Are you racially biased? And do a brain scan of the fact finders before you do a case. Again, profound implications, but that technology is essentially almost here now. We have people who can using this now to look for racial bias, that even if you don't act on it, you have an animus in your brain that they can detect, and people respond differently to people of different colors. And so now employers are talking about, should we use that? If we had a bad record of police prejudice against certain groups, should we start screening our new officers to see if they have that latent racial animus? We could do that now. People have published studies showing that works. But, they haven't done anything wrong. They haven't necessarily acted on that, but they just, in their mind, they have that. Is that enough? Again, we have to figure that out. I have a colleague who's working on using neuroscience to detect pain. A huge issue in court cases, right? Is that person really suffering, or are they just making it up? Now you can do maybe objective testing by using brain scans to detect whether or not they really do have pain or not. We just published a study looking at something like 300 cases in the United States where they've used brain scans in criminal cases. And again, the argument is that this person has some kind of diminished responsibility because of various types of problems with their brain. And it turns out everyone's brain is different when you look at it under brain scanning. And so there's a huge evidentiary issue. But even if you can find there clearly is something wrong with this person's brain, what effect does it have? What does it mean in terms of their responsibility? There's a very famous case of a school teacher who basically lived a perfectly fine life and then all of a sudden started abusing every woman he came across, including his own stepdaughter, was criminally charged with it, and it was found he had a huge brain tumor that seemed to be responsible for that actions. And when they took out the brain tumor, he reverted back to normal. And then a couple years later, he started acting weird again, and it turns out the brain tumor the size of a tennis ball had returned again. So, how do we allocate responsibility when we do have these brain anomalies, these malfunctions, these injuries to the brain, these tumors in the brain that affect our behavior? Is a person still responsible or not? And there's, again, a huge debate going on in people in this area about whether that means we should take into account that in how we charge people and sentence people. Biometrics is another technology that's coming along very quickly. Things like facial recognition technology is now being used in all kinds of ways by casinos. They can tell if you're a card counter. They have a database they're saving. A few years ago at the Super Bowl, when it was in Tampa Bay, they screened all 70,000 people in the audience to see if they were known criminals. I just was sitting beside a guy in Phoenix whose business is scanning the crowds with a facial scanner of every sporting event in Phoenix. And he's connected to all these different databases of known criminals and people who cause disruptions. And they're scanning the audience to see who's there. Are any of these bad people in the audience of this event? And then they'll watch them more carefully if they are. So again, is that a privacy violation? When I go to a hockey game with my kids, I don't think someone's scanning my face, but they are. And so now we're starting to get this brought into the court case. So we had the very first case where they used facial recognition to identify who the actual defendant was. And he argued that was a privacy violation, to use that facial recognition to identify me, and he lost. And so it's already being used in that way. You can now, there's been a number of cases recently in the United States where they've been able to get a picture of a suspect in a case from their DNA alone, to reconstruct their face just from their DNA. And so it's called phenotyping, that you can basically get very accurate facial images just from the DNA alone. There's a great website of an artist who does this, of just DNA she finds on the street, on a cigarette or something. She'll generate the face that goes with that. And when she does it with people she knows, they're amazingly accurate. So again, this power of this technology is suddenly dramatically taking a leap up. And is that some kind of violation? Should police be able to do that? How accurate is it really? And so on. So genetics is going to be used in all kinds of ways for identification that we're only beginning to think about now. So this is a case a judge told me about in Chicago, where she had a small business dispute. You wouldn't think it had anything to do with genetics, but all of a sudden, one of the parties started getting these threatening letters, anonymous letters, and they suspected it was from the other party. The judge confronted him in the courtroom, and he denied he had anything to do with this. So the other side took a deposition of him in their law firm and had a clerk come and take his drinking glass, give him a fresh glass of water, and DNA tests the edge of the glass, compare it to the envelopes, and prove 100% that he was the one who licked that envelope that sent the anonymous thing. And based on this, the judge found he'd perjured himself and accused the plaintiff, dismissed his case. So again, you just start to think of how this genetic information can be used, that we're all leaving genetics everywhere we go, every cup and bottle you're drinking, you're leaving your DNA on. I can find out if you're predisposed to getting Alzheimer's or any other thing. There's a study recently done by a group in Phoenix, where I live, with the FBI, where they can go into a room the day after a meeting and find in the corner the DNA from 300 people. Because we're all shedding hairs and dust and skin cells as we're sitting here. Kind of gross, I know, but they all end up in the corner of the room the next day. And we can go see who was here from their DNA. And so, when you shed your DNA, is that a choice? No. But so are people allowed to use that? In many cities and states in the United States and most countries, you can now go to a testing lab. There's testing labs that will advertise, bring in a straw, bring in gum, bring in a cigarette butt, and we will tell you everything about that person's genes and who the disease is, everything. So, how do UK is the first country to protect against that, but all of a sudden now we're leaving identifiers everywhere. And is that something we should be concerned about? One of the things I do a lot of work on is using genetics in toxic tort cases now. It turns out that the genes that affect things that come into our body are the most variable in our body, that we're all unique in how we respond to chemicals and drugs and foods and even disease viruses and so on. Because these genes are highly variable, from an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense. And so we all react to chemicals, for example, very differently. And so this is now being used in a lot of toxic tort cases to say if that plaintiff is particularly susceptible or not. or you can even use genetic changes to show if they've actually been exposed or not. And so this now provides an objective test you can now do. And again, our tort system is not set up to deal with that. And so we're struggling to figure out how to make sense of that. And some of the cases it helps the plaintiff, and so the plaintiff's using the information. Some of the cases it helps the defendant's doing it. But it's always the DNA of the plaintiff, right? It's sort of asymmetrical that way. You never do the corporate CEO's DNA. It's always the plaintiff. So there's a fairness and a privacy issue there. And then now in 2 cases I've been told about by people I've been on panels with who are expert witnesses, in 2 cases they did the DNA testing of the plaintiff over their objection. So the court under Rule 35 in the United States orders a DNA test because the plaintiffs put their health at issue. They do the DNA testing, and in the course of doing the DNA testing, they discover something that really affects that person's risk, and probably the risk of their family members. That's very important for them to know. There's some like 59 genes now on a list that if you find that gene, the doctor's supposed to tell you about it, even if you don't want to know, because it will affect your life. It could save your life to know that. And so they're finding this information just sort of as a secondary finding, as an inadvertent finding when they're doing the testing to see how this person responds to the chemical. And the problem is no one has a doctor-patient relationship in the case with that plaintiff. So who's going to tell them that and explain that to them? And so the 2 cases I heard about, in one case, the lab director who was out of state, flew on his own dime to go meet with the plaintiff to explain to them what this actually meant. And took it upon himself to pay out of his own pocket to do that. In the other case, the judge decided to become the genetic counselor and brought the plaintiff into his chambers and tried to explain to him, after trying to get up to speed himself, what this meant for him and his family. So now we have judges being genetic counselors to try to deal with this information that we suddenly have coming into our courtrooms, and we don't have a traditional system to explain this to people when we find out things about them that are very important for their future and their health and that of their families. We're using genetic information to solve all kinds of issues and cases and crimes. This is a case where a whole bunch of people turned out to get hepatitis A, I forget what state it was in the southeast United States, and it turns out an anesthetist, person who makes you go to sleep, he was basically skimming off a drug, the morphine, and he was addicted to it and injecting himself, and has spread his hepatitis C to 275 patients. And they are able to prove this by looking at the gene changes in the pathogen to prove it came from that particular doctor. And he was criminally convicted based on that DNA evidence and sentenced to basically 2,000 years in prison. You can now track pathogens by their DNA changes. When they did the Ebola outbreak a few years ago, they're able to track exactly who infected who, that this truck driver picked up this hitchhiker and infected them, because the viruses are constantly changing. By changing the DNA patterns, you can trace exactly where and when who infected who. So this creates all kinds of legal implications in terms of, responsibility for infecting people, and even the NIH was recently found to have infected 7 people with a life-threatening virus, and they were able to track to the exact sink it came from, again by tracking the DNA changes over time in the pathogen and the virus involved. So again, it gives us this incredible information about responsibility. Food poisoning now is completely changed because of DNA. There's a very successful law firm that's their whole business model is basically testing the pathogen in your body that causes sickness and be able to trace it back to a specific company. And so in the past, people would just get sick and sometimes die, and we would never know who caused it. You can now prove who caused it. And so we now have hundreds of these cases coming into the court systems of food poisoning, because you can use DNA to track whose product actually caused your particular sickness. And a little bit more frivolously, but also taken seriously by a lot of people, is dog poop detectors. A number of cities and apartment buildings now require you to get your dog DNA tested, and when they find evidence that's not supposed to be there on the street, they can now determine whose dog it is and penalize you for your dog. You can see the dog on the bottom here isn't too happy about the DNA test. Doesn't really like that at all. You can use microbes that we each are unique in the microbes we have in our body. And they're now using this to investigate crimes to figure out even if people are smart enough to use gloves and other things to not leave DNA behind, they're leaving microbes behind, and be able to track who was actually in that room or in that house when the crime occurred and test it against their own microbial. They can tell, what cities you've been to in the last year or two by your stomach bacteria. That if you've been to Afghanistan, they can now tell that just from your testing your own poop. And so now, national security agencies are interested. Who goes to Afghanistan? Who goes to these countries that we may not be able to track other ways? They can now find that out. So again, has interesting implications. Algorithms are now being used in all kinds of ways. And so we had the first court in the United States, in Wisconsin Supreme Court recently held that you can use a proprietary algorithm in the sentencing process for a criminal. That this is a machine-based, again, artificial intelligence, self-learning system that's basically taking data sets to try and figure out your chances of recommitting a crime after you've served your sentence. And they're able to now use this in the court case in making the sentencing decision. The court said you can't rely exclusively on that, but you're allowed to consider that in your decision-making process. And we're finding that, all these algorithms are now being used in all kinds of decision-making. One of the problems is that they are basically proprietary. You can't look at that algorithm and know how it's making that decision. What is the data sets and so on. There's a fascinating book out called Weapons of Math Destruction that uses all kinds of examples of algorithms giving, erroneous results because they're based on, not even intentionally, but unintentional assumptions sometimes about the data set. She gives an example, the author of, an engineering firm who used an algorithm of what predicts a great engineer because they've been in business 100 years and they wanted to know. And so they hired this firm to basically do this data analytics, and they predicted that the two most important factors for being a successful engineer are being male and being white. That's not really what's going on. It's just that historically, that's who have been engineers through various kinds of discrimination and so on. And so now the model's picking that up and carrying through that discrimination as a predictive thing, which isn't correct. And so you've always got to be careful of these algorithms if they're actually giving you the right results. A lot of us are wearing Fitbits and so on. So here's mine. So it's keeping track of all kinds of things about me. These are now being used in court cases. So we had the first case up in Canada where it was a question of an injury. A person was getting workers' comp. And so she was able to use her Fitbit to show the change in her activity before and after the injury, to show how it affected her lifestyle pretty dramatically with an objective set of data. We've had a case where, in the United States, where someone was claimed to have been raped, and they used their Fitbit to prove that, in fact, that was a fabrication, that they weren't raped at the time they said they were, because there was no activity on their Fitbit. And then just recently, we had a person who was basically convicted of murder, who claimed someone had broken into a house and murdered his wife, and they were able to use his Fitbit records to show that he was the one who actually probably did it, and use that as part of other evidence to convict him of the actual murder. So again, we're creating all these data sets that can be used in all kinds of important ways, but also ways that can sometimes freak us out. You may have heard a case in Arkansas recently where someone was murdered in a house, and the police have subpoenaed the Alexa in their household in case it recorded anything. And it's raised this issue of, what does Alexa record? Is it recording all the time or only when you say Alexa? And it seems it's maybe the latter, but we don't know that for sure. And so the police tried to get this information, and Amazon asserted a First Amendment right, that the Alexa has a First Amendment right not to have its speech subpoenaed. And they eventually gave that up, and they gave out the evidence. But many of us now have these in our house. I have a 14-year-old son, and when we got Alexa, the first thing he said is, "This isn't going in my room." So he was ahead of the time. But this is recording stuff in your house all the time and keep it on a database somewhere that can then be accessed. Again, they're incredibly convenient. That's why these things are so popular, but they're also the other side to them as well. This is a guy who actually uses pacemaker records to prove that he burned his own house. He claimed that he did all these things to try to stop it, and his pacemaker records showed that was impossible. And so that was, again, used to convict him of arson. Again, using, is that a Fifth Amendment, self-incrimination to use your own pacemaker against you? And the court held it wasn't. We have 3D printing and 3D scanning as a new technology being used in a number of cases now, where you basically have these companies are making these incredibly powerful scanners that you just sort of set it up and it takes a complete multi-dimensional view of an area in 3 dimensionals, and then using this in a courtroom to then present evidence about what actually occurred and what the crime scene was like, and reenacting it for the jurors with incredible accuracy, and being able to sort of cross-examine it and sort of fly right into it, whatever you want. Incredibly powerful, again, to show what actually occurred in this particular crime or accident or whatever it is. And then we have Bitcoin and blockchain. You may have heard of blockchain. It's going to be one of these profound technologies. It's sort of known right now as sort of the technology behind Bitcoin, a digital currency. But most people think the blockchain is much more important than Bitcoin. And every major bank is now working on and using blockchain as basically an online record-keeping system for all kinds of transactions. Real estate, banking, whatever, sales, contracts. And so these are going to be coming into our courtrooms. And the question is, are these blockchains even admissible? Are they hearsay? And so they've already started to sort of churn on this a little bit, and people are debating whether these can be used. How will courts determine, these blockchains' validity? Because there'll be thousands of them. There won't be just one. There'll be thousands of different ones. How do you determine if any one of them's legitimate and trustworthy and so on? So again, this new technology, we can see it coming big time. We're all going to be interacting with blockchains in the next 5 years. In all of our banking, real estate, contracts, it's going to become the de facto technology behind all those. And now, all of a sudden, our legal system is going to have to, any dispute involving financial things is probably going to involve some kind of blockchain aspect that we're going to have to figure out, what does it mean, how do we understand it, and so on. So we have all these different technologies, and then we have digital fabrication. This is a cover story of Martha Stewart when she got out of jail on Newsweek, and that was a fabricated picture. Turned out Newsweek couldn't get a picture of her, so they took her head and put it on someone else's body and put it on the cover of Newsweek. This is from the year 2000, Times Square. And one of the major TV networks took out a big billboard electronic ad. The other two stations blanked it out. They showed something else there. They digitally changed the picture that you're seeing in real time to take out their competitors' ads. And you had no idea that was occurring. It was only afterwards this was revealed. So when we see things now, we no longer know if it's accurate, because when it's digital, it's much more easy to manipulate, and it's much harder to detect if it's been manipulated. So I got interested in this when a colleague of mine was litigating a case in Phoenix, and it turns out someone had changed a digital document that was key to the case. And the only reason he found out is that the legal assistant on the other side had got fired for something else and squealed on them, was a whistleblower. And so he wrote a book for the ABA on this, and it had dozens of cases of fabricated digital evidence and how hard it is to detect it. So we're now getting all this digital evidence coming into our courtrooms, but it's much easier to fabricate and to alter. And it's very difficult, unless you're really expert and spend a lot of resources and aware of this, that it could be manipulated. And so again, how do we deal with that in our legal systems? We rely more and more on digital evidence. So let me talk about two other things, and I think you've probably talked a lot about these at this meeting, so I'll try to be a little shorter on these ones. So one is access to the courts, and we heard a little bit about that in our previous presentation. I guess you've heard about it elsewhere in the system. So we now have these bots that various people are developing to basically help you do things online. And this first one that was around basically helped you get off a speeding ticket, or a parking ticket, and it helped something like 160,000 people in the Great Britain primarily to and you just go online and you enter your details, and it asks you a bunch of questions. Again, it's machine learning. It's learning itself. It's not programmed to do this. It's got this huge data set it's based on, and it's now learning each case, and it asks you a bunch of questions to look for an angle that it can then make the best argument, and it spits out the document for you that you can then use to challenge your your parking ticket. And so this has been incredibly successful. It's, again, giving people access to court. And just yesterday, this site went live with 1,000 different types of legal cases you can bring. It's now available in all 50 United States and across the UK as of yesterday. So after I made my slide on Monday, it completely expanded itself to now be available, again, with this huge research base to look at all these different 1,000 types of cases and be able to go online and basically access that. And so I did it for a pretend parking ticket, and it's fascinating. It just asks you all these questions, say, well, you sure you couldn't make an argument here? Or what about this? Did you do this? Looking for every angle to try and get you off your parking ticket. And now it's going to do it for 1,000 different types of cases. I haven't gone on a new site yet to know how it's working, but it apparently was up as of yesterday. There's another group of 7 different countries is going to have this launch on July 24th called LawBotX. Same thing, as an online system to basically help you, give you free legal advice. So again, I don't think this is necessarily a competition or challenge to legal firms, because these are basically people who can't afford lawyers. And as we heard in the last talk from David, that there's a tremendous number of people who can't get access to legal services. They can't afford it. Now all of a sudden they're going to use these bots to do this. But again, it raises some concerns about, who is designing these bots, who's behind them. They're not a public institution like a court. They're private companies. They're probably doing it, at least the first ones, for goodwill, to try and help people. But again, you can imagine it being manipulated going forward. How do you know what algorithm it's using? Because it's not going to be necessarily accessible. Microsoft and the Legal Services Corporation just recently announced a major initiative to create an online dispute resolution system. Again, going around the courts and making a private dispute resolution system for people who can't afford their own legal services. And then the Netherlands was sort of one of the innovators with this online dispute resolution system, mostly for divorces, that was able to do divorces online for much cheaper and much quicker than you could by going through lawyers. And so again, this now does start to threaten lawyers a little bit. And unfortunately, this place just went offline a couple months ago. And there's still questions about what went on behind that, why did it go down, but they're going to now relaunch it as just a divorce thing only in Netherlands. But it was sort of the first online court system that's separate from the court systems, completely non-integrated with our public courts, as a separate standalone system for litigating these kind of cases. And you probably talked about Madria sometime in this meeting. This is the dispute resolution from eBay that evolved into more of a publicly available dispute resolution service. Again, separate from our public courts, as a competitor, so to speak, of our public courts, of a way to resolve disputes. And they've done several million cases already. It just got bought by a large private company. And that company's major clients is city and state governments and county governments. So the question is, how will they use this? Will they use this to integrate with our existing courts that those cities and counties run? Will they operate as a competitor, as an alternative to our public courts? I think that remains, this has just happened last month or two. It remains to be seen. But again, as the previous presentation talked about, courts suddenly have to face a possibility that they're going to have competitors, that they don't have this monopoly we've had for centuries. All of a sudden now there's these private competitors, and how can we compete against them? Or maybe sometimes it's better for these online services to take over certain types of cases, particularly when people can't afford to hire lawyers and litigate it themselves. Margaret was talking about the Canadian system, the CRT in British Columbia. I'm from British Columbia, so very proud that they're doing this here in British Columbia, and I think they just started taking their first cases in June. Where they're actually deciding small civil cases, I think under $5,000 or something to begin with. And then the UK is similarly committed to doing a similar thing to launch in the next year or so an online court system that will be integrated with their court system. And so, that's a big challenge. The choice is, should you integrate these online dispute resolution with existing courts, or having standalone separate as competitors or as alternatives to our existing courts? So we see that there really is this interesting movement to use technology to create increased access to the legal system. I think it does create a lot of issues to the courts of competitors, but it also will deal with this problem that we have, a very large percentage of our population underserved by our legal system, who don't have the knowledge or the resources or whatever it is to basically take advantage of legal disputes or even know they have a legal issue. Brigham Young University, their law school, has just started a new program in the last couple of weeks to use technology to create access to courts. So I think this is going to become a bigger and bigger thing as we go forward, using technology to increase access. And the question is, how will it impact our existing courts? Then the final topic I want to talk about is just changes to the courtroom. How will this affect the courts as institutions? Richard Susskind, who's sort of one of the, I think, best writers on this, has written a number of books. I recommend his newest one, is version 2 of Tomorrow's Lawyers. He says our court systems are moving from being a place to a service. As we're basically going more and more online and digital, we're no longer a building so much as we are a service online. And that has all kinds of profound implications for every aspect of courts, from its security, its staffing, and many other dimensions that are sometimes kind of subtle. But that's paradigm change is occurring, and that's going to have all kinds of implications for our courtrooms, as the last presentation talked about some of those. So Susskind writes, you can call me radical, but it seems to me that if we can see the day in which the average desktop machine has more processing power than all of humanity combined, then it might be time for lawyers to rethink some of their working practices. And certainly, as Margaret was talking about, these analytics programs that law firms are now using, it's really changing the way law firms do business. The courts sort of lag behind a little bit, but the courts are going to also be brought into this of how do we deal with these new types of technologies and work in different ways. There's all kinds of tech startups, all these small, innovative, creative companies are doing all kinds of things in the legal space. It's a very hot growth area right now. Many of these just affect legal practice primarily, but many of them will also affect how evidence is brought into the courts and how courts are operating in this. And so there's a lot of innovation, a lot of disruptive innovation going on in this area. The bars and other entities are starting to respond to this. This print is too small to see, but the ABA had a commission on the future of legal services last year where they said technology is going to be just a major change, a disruptive innovation for our legal system, including the courts, and talked about various ways courts will be changed. The British UK Ministry of Justice did a similar thing by their top judge, Lord Chief Justice, transform our justice system. Again, talking about how technology's fundamentally going to change our courts. And both of these reports talked about courts sort of being laggards a little bit. Like David in the previous presentation was talking about, courts have sort of been slow, but that it's not going to be able to continue for any much longer, that we are going to be changed as these technologies are changing. And so we're going to have all kinds of other funky stuff going on in our courtrooms. This is there's companies now that basically are using facial recognition in jury consulting. So for countries that have jurors, that you can do in the voir dire, where you're basically having these jurors being questioned in real time. They can take pictures of them in the courtroom, connect to all their social media statements and so on to see if they've talked about this case or being on the jury or anything else that's relevant. And in real time, to the lawyer's laptop sitting there in the courtroom, give data on what this juror does out in the real world and what they say on their social media and so on. Again, is that appropriate or not? One judge in California just ruled that if companies do this or if litigants do this, they have to tell the jurors what they're doing. And so that's putting it on them. They can do it, but then they have to disclose it. Other companies are developing these products that you can basically monitor the judge or the jury to see their facial expressions, to see how they're responding to different arguments and so on in real time. Again, helping the lawyers to craft their arguments that most appeal to the fact finders. But again, is this appropriate to have this in the courtroom? Should we allow it in the courtroom? Can we not allow it? Will we even be able to tell if it's just going to be on a smartphone, these programs and so on? A fascinating article in the Yale Law Journal this year about machine testimony. That again, as these machines have their self-learning and they basically teach themselves, they will become the witnesses. There won't be any human who can explain to it, to the jury, to the judge, why it did what it did. It's only the machine that will do this. And so now you're going to have judges or lawyers or, interrogating on a witness stand maybe, a machine, and asking it why it decided that, why it did what it did, what was its rationale. And that's going to be, again, a profound change to our legal system to have machines as witnesses. What kind of rights do they have? What kind of, hearsay and so on. But that's here basically now. Virtual reality, there's a number of companies developing virtual reality to use in courtrooms. Again, allowing the fact finder, whether it's a judge or jury, to be in the situation of the crime or the accident, to actually experience it. And I don't know if you've ever done virtual reality, but it's incredibly profound. You really think you're there. You put on these glasses. People get sick a lot. They did this one that we did with our kids, where you basically try and step off a building, and it's just this high off the ground, but most people can't do it. You really do feel you're going to fall. It's just like you are there. And so now you're going to be able to reenact crimes or accidents using these kind of technologies in the courtroom. And so how do you set up a courtroom to do that? How do you, how do you ensure that the program is accurately representing the accident or the crime, that it's not being tilted in subtle little ways to favor one side or the other? So again, suddenly we have this very valuable, effective technology, and we're going to be confronted very quickly because it's already being used in some cases. It's not the future, it's happening now that people are actually using this in some criminal cases now and some accidents now to figure out how to incorporate that in our court system. You have programs now basically to help decide who are the best attorneys and who are the best judges for a certain type of case. That they're selling this to the public, that if you have a DUI, for example, in Florida where this has started, which judges and when you know your judge, which lawyer will work best with that judge to get you the best result. Again, using big data and analytics and algorithms to basically customize your likelihood, best chance of success. Is that fair? Is that good? I don't know, but it's going to change, again, how we do our legal system. This is another one of these legal analytic programs that's basically selling a product on judge analytics to tell the people who pay for this service what words the judge likes and doesn't like, what precedents you should cite for them, what arguments they like and don't, based on their history of what they've written, not only as a judge and their opinions, but any law review articles they wrote as a student, whatever they can find, whatever social media things they've done. They basically put that all in a database and create an analytic to help you, as a lawyer, best craft your arguments to be appealing to that particular judge. So it's almost like a privacy invasion of the judge, right? That everything they've said is now collected together and used to sort of, manipulate how the judge will decide the case based on what arguments or words or precedents that will appeal to that particular judge. Again, it's going to give some lawyers a huge advantage when they have this and the others don't. And when I talk to judges about that, they sort of feel kind of creepy about this. That there's a database with all their stuff in there, that's sort of judging them. And then even creepier for judges is there's all kinds of analytics showing all kinds of weird things about judges. So this is one study that shows if your football team as a judge loses, you're much likely to get a more harsher sentence the next week. I mean, who would have thought that, right? But it turns out it's a fact. It's data showing that. Maybe it's good for judges to know that. So if their football team does lose, or their soccer team in Britain or whatever, that they'll take that into account. There's studies showing that, when the judge is hungry, they give much stricter sentences, before lunch and after lunch. Who would have thought it? Judges are very reasonable people, but it turns out they're human too. And there's all these subtle influences that we can now discern out that affects their decision making. And so how should we take account of that? When I used to work for General Motors as a private lawyer, they told me, whenever you buy a car, tell us the VIN number and we'll tell you if it's made on a Monday or Friday. You don't want to buy it those days because people are either tired from the weekend or looking forward to the weekend and that's when we have most of our defects in our cars, made on Monday and Friday. So, buy a VIN number for a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday car. So you're basically all customized now our legal services in the same way of which judge and which team and, how do you want to be before lunch or after lunch, depending if you're prosecution or defense. All these things we're now going to have data showing us stuff that was just noise in the past we didn't even think about all of a sudden here. So it's a very different world. And now, of course, we have legal machines that are basically doing law work for us. And so Ross was the first one. There's now a number of other products that basically do legal services, that basically do the legal research, draft documents. It's all done by machine now in a matter of seconds, what would take an associate several weeks to do. And again, this will be coming into our court systems. And the question is, what happens if it makes a mistake? Who's responsible? Is it the lawyer? The whole point is the client won't pay the lawyer to do this anymore. They'll just have a machine do it very quickly and cheaply. And so then how does accountability, how does a lawyer, when they go into a courtroom, they're responsible for the cases they cite to the court. All of a sudden now it's a machine that is. How will that affect legal responsibility, malpractice, and so on? And it is this whole issue of technological unemployment is, I think, a serious one going forward. J.P. Morgan just last year alone removed 360,000 hours of legal work, billable hours, by using artificial intelligence, machine learning, to basically replace lawyers, hundreds of lawyers, full-time. They replaced in 1 year. This is one company. So as we go forward, I think every profession, including the legal profession, from lawyers to courts to court personnel, how will this technology displace us? And there's projections that something like 40 or 50% of the jobs in the country will be gone in the next 20, 30 years because of machines. What will be the social impact of that? How will that affect our lives and our society if half our population doesn't have jobs anymore? If they had some way to live, maybe it'd be great. They do art or something, but they got to make a living somehow. And so how are we going to deal with that? So there's a lot of profound issues technology is raising for the courts and broader. So just to conclude then, I love this quote from Felix Frankfurter: if the facts are changing, law cannot be static. And I think law here is the institutions of law too, that the world around us is changing at an unprecedented scale. We can't be complacent, we can't be static. We have to be changing with it. I think the courts have legitimately been criticized as one of the slower moving institutions in the past, and that no longer can be the case, as I think David and Margaret said very clearly in the previous presentation. We have to figure out how to embrace change, how to move forward in a much more agile way. And if we don't, I think the court system is going to be left behind. I'm from Canada, as I mentioned, and hockey's a game of Canada, and the best hockey player ever is a guy named Wayne Gretzky, who I hated because he was never on my team, and he always beat my team. And I could never figure it out because he wasn't the fastest player, he wasn't the biggest player, he didn't have the hardest shot. There's no physical reason why he was so great, but he was. And after he retired, he made this statement that totally made sense. I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. And it just struck me that's exactly what he did. He always was somehow positioned in some kind of weird place that the puck would just end up with, and he'd score or set up a goal. He just had this uncanny ability to anticipate how the future is going to unfold, how the play is going to unfold. And I think that's what we in the legal profession have to start to do. We have to think that in a time of incredible change, with an unprecedented pace of change, how do we position ourselves not where things are today, because those are quickly obsolete, but as things are changing, how do we sort of plan ahead and be ready for the changes that are going to come? And that's a real challenge, but it's something I think we have to keep in mind every day. So with that, let me close and thank you, and hope you had a great conference.